It began with a demolition. In August 2015, a construction crew arrived to tear down an abandoned cabin that had sat empty for years on a quiet Colorado road. The structure leaned slightly, the windows boarded, the walls rotting under the weight of long winters. When one worker pried loose the fireplace bricks, a smell poured out that stopped them cold. Something inside the chimney blocked the chute. At first, they thought it was insulation or a raccoon nest. Then they saw fabric, denim, and beneath it, bone. The cabin filled with silence. By the time police arrived, the air had turned heavy, electric. Whoever had been inside that chimney had been there a long time. When they pulled the remains free, they found them curled upward, knees toward chest, as though the boy had tried to climb out. And from the position of his arms, he never had the chance. Dental records identified him quickly. Joshua Maddox, 18 years old, missing since 2008. To the people of Woodland Park, he wasn't a mystery, he was a memory. Everyone remembered Josh as the boy who played guitar on the porch, who laughed too loudly, who said he'd be right back one May morning and never returned. For 7 years, his family had searched forests, rivers, back roads, anywhere a teenager might wander when the world felt too small. When the coroner called, his sister nearly dropped the phone. She'd always believed he'd come home one day. Instead, home had been waiting for him just a mile away, sealed behind bricks. No one could explain how his body ended up in a chimney barely 12 inches wide. Investigators began with logistics. The chimney's opening was high off the ground, accessible only from the roof. There was no soot on Josh's hands, no evidence of fire. The fireplace itself was blocked by a heavy metal grate that hadn't been moved in years. From the inside, escape would have been impossible. Yet somehow, he was there, shirtless, shoeless, wedged upside down. The coroner ruled out foul play almost immediately, calling it misadventure. He theorized that Josh had climbed in voluntarily, maybe seeking shelter from the cold only to get trapped. But even the construction workers didn't buy it. No one would climb head first down a chimney that narrow. Something didn't fit, literally or logically. And when reporters pressed for answers, the sheriff's office stopped taking calls. The cabin belonged to Chuck Murphy, a retired contractor known around town for keeping to himself. He'd built the place decades earlier as a hangout for his sons, but after they moved away, it became storage, then an eyesore. He swore he hadn't stepped inside in years. When police questioned him, he seemed genuinely horrified. He told them he'd noticed a foul odor once or twice but assumed it was a dead animal. Still, rumors sprouted immediately that Murphy knew more than he claimed, that the cabin had hosted parties where things got out of hand, that someone in town had sealed the fireplace to hide a mistake. None of it was proven, but small towns run on stories, and once a new one takes root, truth becomes irrelevant. The chimney wasn't just a crime scene now. It was a confession written in brick. The autopsy deepened the confusion. There were no broken bones typical of a fall, no signs of struggle or restraint. Josh's body was largely intact, preserved by the dry mountain air. Toxicology showed nothing, no drugs, no alcohol. He hadn't been chased, attacked, or intoxicated. He'd simply died. The official report listed accidental confinement, but the pathologist admitted privately that he'd never seen anything like it. The chimney was too tight for anyone to enter voluntarily, and Josh's position suggested he'd been placed there, or that someone had helped him start the descent. When his family asked the lead investigator whether they were closing the case, he paused before answering, "We don't have evidence of a crime." It was the kind of statement that closes files, not wounds. The last time anyone saw Joshua alive, it was an ordinary morning in May 2008. The sky was clear, the street quiet, and he'd told his sister Ruth that he was going out for a walk. He didn't take his wallet, his phone, or even a jacket, just a light shirt, jeans, and sneakers. His family assumed he'd gone into the woods behind their house, a place he loved for its silence. When hours passed, then days, they called police. Searches followed, volunteers combing the forest trails with dogs and lanterns. Nothing. It was as if he'd stepped off the map. Over the years, leads trickled in. Someone thought they'd seen him hitchhiking near Colorado Springs. Another swore he'd joined a commune out west. Theories grew with the seasons, each more desperate than the last. But in a town as small as Woodland Park, vanishing completely should have been impossible. And yet, for 7 years, it was. When the truth surfaced, what struck everyone hardest wasn't how Joshua was found, but where. The cabin stood less than a mile from his home, a short walk through the trees. Search teams had passed it dozens of times. Some had even peeked through the windows. But no one thought to check the chimney. The cabin wasn't marked on official property maps anymore, and its isolation made it easy to forget. When the coroner's report was released, a line buried halfway down the page shattered the family. Remains discovered within structure located approximately 900 yards from family residence. A 7-year mystery, hiding in plain sight. His father, Ben, later told reporters that it felt like the world had been playing a cruel joke. The search for Joshua had stretched across states, yet the answer had been visible from his own backyard. The proximity was its own horror, not the distance between him and home, but between truth and the people looking for it. The fireplace became the investigation's obsession. Built decades earlier, it was unusually narrow, barely large enough for an adult arm to reach through. Investigators measured the flue, the angle, the distance between bricks. To enter head first, as Joshua had, meant climbing onto the roof, removing the chimney cap, and lowering oneself down, a maneuver that would have required not only balance, but intent. The coroner insisted he may have been seeking shelter, perhaps trying to enter the cabin through the chimney when locked out. But those who'd known him scoffed. Joshua was 6 feet tall, athletic, not reckless. He'd built tree houses, rock-climbed the canyon walls nearby. He would have known the chimney was too tight. So why did the evidence suggest otherwise? Some speculated he'd been forced at gunpoint. Others believed he'd already been unconscious when placed there. Every new theory only raised more impossible questions. When investigators revisited the original missing person reports, inconsistencies began to surface. One witness, a local drifter named Andy, who'd known Joshua loosely, claimed he'd seen him days after his disappearance, heading toward the highway with a group. Yet police never verified the claim, and Andy died of an overdose shortly after giving his statement. Later, another resident said they'd seen someone enter the abandoned cabin late one night around the same time Joshua went missing, but the report wasn't filed until years later after the body was found. Meanwhile, online forums picked apart every timeline, convinced the official story had holes. Some argued that Joshua had been lured there. Others insisted it was suicide staged to look accidental. But nothing fit neatly. There was no note, no motive, and no logical reason to climb headfirst into darkness. The only certainty was that someone at some point had sealed the chimney shut from the outside. After the discovery, locals began to talk about the cabin in tones once reserved for graveyards. Teenagers dared each other to visit it before demolition, but most stopped at the tree line, spooked by the silence that seemed to hum around it. Chuck Murphy, the owner, sold the land soon after and refused to discuss it publicly. Those who worked on the demolition described the same strange feeling, a cold spot near the fireplace, the kind that prickles your skin without warning. One worker later told a local paper that he'd felt like someone was still in there. Police closed the case within months, labeling it a tragic accident. But for the people who lived there, closure never came. You can remove a house, they said, but not what it leaves behind. In Woodland Park, the cabin was gone, but the story built itself a new home in memory where it would never crumble. The coroner's report was supposed to end debate, but it only fueled it. While the sheriff's office accepted the accidental confinement ruling, independent pathologists disagreed. They noted the lack of abrasions on Joshua's shoulders or head, injuries expected if he'd forced himself into such a narrow space. There were no fingernail scratches on the brick, no torn clothing from struggling. And then there was the absence of soot in his lungs. If he'd been alive during entry, he should have inhaled residue from the chimney walls. But his airway was clean. That meant he may have already been dead. The official coroner later admitted to a journalist that there were unanswered questions that couldn't be resolved without speculation. Speculation, however, was exactly what everyone else was willing to do. The data didn't match the story, and that mismatch created something worse than mystery. It created possibility. After the news broke, several locals came forward claiming they'd explored the abandoned cabin in the years after Joshua disappeared. None remembered seeing or smelling anything unusual. The structure had stood quiet through summers and winters alike, with kids tagging its walls and leaving beer bottles behind. One teenager recalled sitting by the same fireplace during a storm in 2011, using a flashlight and swearing he'd heard tapping inside the chimney. His friends laughed, calling it rain. Another said he'd carved his initials into the mantel in 2012, less than 3 feet from where Joshua's body would later be found. These details made the official timeline impossible to reconcile. How had no one noticed the scent of decay, the weight behind the bricks? Either the body wasn't there the entire time, or the truth about when it arrived had been carefully misremembered. In 2016, a journalist digging through court archives found something odd. A name? The cabin where Joshua was discovered had once been connected to another case, an unsolved disappearance from the early 1990s. A man named Al P. Dash, who'd last been seen near that same stretch of forest, had vanished without a trace. His car was found parked less than half a mile away. At the time, police concluded he'd left voluntarily. No one connected the two events until decades later, when property records revealed both men's disappearances involved the same landowner. It could have been coincidence. It probably was. But when reporters asked the sheriff's office whether they had re-examined older missing persons cases near the property, they refused to comment. In Woodland Park, silence had become the town's default defense mechanism. Theories reached a fever pitch when a man from out of state posted online claiming responsibility. His username matched no real identity, but his story was disturbingly specific. He described sealing a body in a Colorado cabin chimney and taunted investigators for ignoring him. Detectives traced the IP to a motel near Denver. When they arrived, the room was empty, except for a single laptop still running, screen glowing with static. Forensics traced the message back to an internet relay chain too complex to decode. Some believed it was a hoax, a cruel attempt to capitalize on tragedy. Others thought it was something darker, not a confession, but a warning. After that, the sheriff's department quietly archived the case and stopped issuing statements altogether. To this day, no one knows whether they ever found who posted it, or if they even wanted to. Time has a strange way of bending in small towns. Years later, the Maddox home still stands, unchanged, its porch sagging under snow. Locals say Joshua's guitar still sits in the corner of his room, unplayed, dust gathered across the strings. His family eventually moved away, but they never changed the locks. It still feels like he could walk through the door, his sister once said in an interview, her voice trembling between grief and disbelief. Every few months, someone places fresh flowers by the old chimney site. No note, no name. The town never speaks of who does it, but everyone knows. Woodland Park learned something the rest of the world never will. Sometimes the dead don't haunt you. Sometimes it's the questions that do. Years after the chimney was torn down, people began reporting strange moments of recall, like the case itself had left an echo inside them. A police clerk who had filed the autopsy photos claimed she could still hear the click of the shutter in her sleep. A demolition worker said that each winter, when he smelled wood smoke, he saw the outline of the cabin's doorway in the frost on his truck window. None of them believed in ghosts, but all agreed that some memories refused to stay put. They moved through people like drafts, through broken glass, invisible but felt. When a psychology student from Denver interviewed residents for a thesis on collective trauma, she wrote that Woodland Park functions like a mind that cannot repress. The community, she said, was haunted not by a person, but by the act of not knowing. In 2019, a retired records officer, sorting through an evidence vault, uncovered a mislabeled thumb drive tucked inside an old envelope marked Maddox, MISC. On it were digital photos never entered into the official database, 32 images in total. Most were routine, brick measurements, angle diagrams, scale references, but the last 4 were different. They showed the fireplace from inside the cabin, taken weeks before demolition. In the corner of one frame, faint but visible, was what looked like a boot print on the interior grate, pointing upward, not down. Analysts later said it could have been a trick of shadow or residue from an animal. Still, when the discovery went public, the file was quietly resealed within days. The county claimed it had been leaked without context. Yet among those who saw it, the conversation changed. The question was no longer, how did he get in there, but who else had been there first? Online investigators obsessed over that image. They overlaid it with photos from the 1990s Disappearance, cross-referenced soil samples, and found something chilling. Both properties sat along a single geological fault line, one that caused low-frequency vibrations often mistaken for infrasound. Scientists know that infrasound can trigger anxiety, dread, even hallucinations of presence. Podcasters seized on the idea that the cabin itself might have amplified that frequency, twisting perception. Perhaps Joshua hadn't been chased at all. Perhaps he'd heard something, a pressure that drove him to flee downward instead of out. The theory was fascinating, almost scientific enough to be believable, but locals rejected it outright. "We've lived here our whole lives," one resident said. "The only thing we ever heard was silence." And silence, everyone agreed, was what made the case unbearable. In 2022, Joshua's sister received a manila envelope postmarked from Arizona. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice, handwritten in blue ink. "You looked in the wrong direction." He didn't climb in. No signature, no fingerprints. Postal inspectors traced the stamp to a general delivery office near Flagstaff, but the sender was never identified. The family turned it over to authorities. They logged it and never spoke of it again. To outsiders, it sounded like another cruel prank. To those who had followed the case, it felt like confirmation of what they'd always suspected, that someone out there still carried knowledge heavy enough to mail across states, but not heavy enough to confess. The handwriting was shaky, deliberate, as though written by someone afraid the truth might hear them. Today, the lot where the cabin stood is an empty rectangle of grass ringed by pines. Children bike past it on their way to school. In summer, dandelions push through the soil, bright and harmless. Yet even in daylight, the place carries an odd stillness. Sound seems to dull at its center. Hikers say birds won't perch on the chimney's old foundation stones. At night, headlights from the road flash briefly across the clearing, catching something pale, maybe quartz in the dirt, maybe a trick of the eye. The county lists the land as undeveloped residential. Locals call it the Hollow Yard. And when fog drifts down from the mountains, it pools there first, swirling like breath caught between exhale and memory. Nothing moves, nothing answers. Only the wind, whispering through the pines, the same question no one has solved. Why would anyone climb head first into the dark? Even after the last evidence box was archived, the story refused to die. The sheriff's office still received letters from amateur investigators convinced they'd solved it, each one stranger than the last. Some sent detailed diagrams of the cabin, others enclosed hand-drawn maps of energy lines they believed intersected the site. One man mailed a chimney flue he'd dismantled from his own home, claiming it spoke when the wind passed through. The officers stopped responding, but the case lingered in the public imagination like an unanswered knock. Every few months, a new documentary or podcast resurrected Joshua's name, repeating the same handful of facts as if repetition might summon clarity. Yet the more the story was told, the less it belonged to the people who'd lived it. It had become folklore, shared property of the curious, the morbid, and the lost. In 2024, a national streaming service announced a new docu-series titled Head First, The Chimney Mystery. Film crews descended on Woodland Park with drones, bright lights, and questions already sharpened for television. They interviewed old officers, neighbors, and the demolition workers who still remembered the smell. Each claimed they wanted truth, but everyone could tell they were really chasing atmosphere. The production left after 2 months, having captured enough grief to fill an hour. The premiere drew millions of views. The town got a burst of tourism it never wanted. Strangers wandered through the forest with cameras and shovels, trampling what little peace had grown there. The Maddox family, now scattered across states, released a single statement: "Please let Joshua rest. But rest, it seemed, was the one thing this story refused to grant. The documentary's release inspired a wave of online thrill-seekers. Groups of urban explorers began visiting other abandoned cabins in the region, live-streaming their hunts for haunted architecture. They pried open cellars, posted footage of empty chimneys, and tagged their uploads with Joshua's name. One night, a pair of them claimed to have discovered another fireplace sealed with concrete deep in the forest. When they tried to break it open, their connection cut abruptly. Hours later, they uploaded an apology video, faces pale, refusing to explain what they'd seen. It might have been a marketing stunt, or it might not. Either way, it added another layer of unease to a case already swollen with it. Even the skeptics began to admit that the line between investigation and invocation had become impossible to see. Among the noise, one voice stood out, a local historian named Meredith Crane. She'd spent years cataloging every report tied to the Chimney case, tracing ownership records back a century. Her conclusion was unnervingly simple. The property had changed hands dozens of times, and nearly every owner reported someone disappearing on or near it. She mapped the pattern, concentric circles radiating outward from the original foundation. "It's not cursed," she said in an interview. "It's just a place people use to hide what they can't explain." Her theory wasn't supernatural, but it unsettled people more than ghosts. It implied that the tragedy of the Maddox case wasn't isolated. It was part of a ritual of forgetting that the land itself had learned to repeat. And repetition, she warned, always leaves an imprint. Now, more than 15 years after Joshua's disappearance, the woods have begun reclaiming what remains. Saplings push through the driveway cracks, moss eats the stones that once framed the chimney. At dusk, the forest hums with insects, the same sound that filled the air the morning he left home. Occasionally, a hiker will stumble onto the clearing, take a photo, and post it online with a caption like, "Found the chimney site." The image will circle the internet for a day, then vanish into the endless scroll of new mysteries. The police no longer comment. The family no longer answers calls. But when the wind threads through the trees just right, locals say it makes a low, hollow tone, the same pitch bricks make when pried loose. And every year, that sound seems to last a little longer, as if the forest itself is learning how to breathe through what it buried. Every investigation needs an ending. The mind craves the neatness of cause and effect. But the Maddox case refused neatness, and it began to devour the people who chased it. The Denver student who had written her thesis on collective trauma returned to the site for follow-up research and never submitted her second paper. Her colleagues said she'd grown withdrawn, speaking only of hearing movement inside the walls. A retired podcaster who'd built his reputation on unsolved cases shut down his channel after driving to Woodland Park and sitting alone at the clearing for 3 nights. When asked why, he only said, "There's nothing to solve, only something to hear." The story didn't just inspire curiosity, it replaced it. Those who looked long enough into the unanswered space found it staring back, as if the void inside that chimney had learned to mimic a question. Online, the case mutated. Threads multiplied, theories contradicted one another, and eventually users began cataloging not evidence, but behavior. They noticed that people who spent months studying the photographs or transcripts often reported identical dreams. Tight, breathless spaces, walls that narrowed the harder you struggled. Psychologists called it empathetic confinement, a manifestation of reading about claustrophobic death. But others believed the story itself was infectious, that the imagery had become a digital haunting. Posts appeared describing faint chimney smells in rooms with no fireplace, the sound of wind moving downwards instead of up. The internet had done what the forest once did, built another place for the story to hide. And in that place, truth became impossible to separate from atmosphere. In 2025, a freelance journalist named Clara Dent arrived in town claiming she would finish it. She was methodical, skeptical, and armed with more technology than any previous investigator. For months, she interviewed locals, gathered soil samples, and mapped magnetic anomalies around the site. Then, without explanation, she withdrew her press credentials and vanished from social media. When friends broke into her rented cabin weeks later, they found her camera equipment stacked neatly by the window and a notebook on the desk. The final line read, "He wasn't stuck going down. He was waiting to come out." There was no sign of Clara. Her car remained parked in the drive, keys still in the ignition. Police filed no report. The county had had enough of mysteries. The clearing once again had added another absence to its count. By then, Woodland Park had learned to stop reacting. The story had woven itself into everything. Real estate listings that omitted street names, tourists who asked for directions in whispers, teachers who skipped the chapter on local history. Even those who mocked the legend carried its rhythm in their speech. Pauses where a name should be, glances toward the tree line mid-sentence. The hollow wasn't a place anymore. It was a habit. It followed anyone who heard the story, a soft pressure at the back of the throat, the feeling of air too thin to finish a word. The townsfolk didn't try to break it. You can't rebuild a house when you suspect the foundation itself remembers. When night drapes itself over Woodland Park now, the forest looks whole again. No ruins, no signs, no reason to stop the car. Yet travelers still do. They roll down their windows, drawn by the stillness, and listen for the sound that everyone describes differently: wind, whisper, breath, hum. It's quieter than memory, but louder than peace. For a heartbeat, they almost understand why someone might have crawled toward it, mistaking it for a way out. Then the noise fades, the moment collapses, and the engine starts again. The headlights stretch forward, cutting through the dark until there's nothing left to see. And behind them, in that space between tree trunks and silence, the unanswered question remains, waiting for the next voice to ask it aloud. 17 years have passed since Joshua Maddox vanished, yet the case refuses to fade. In early 2025, a viral TikTok series titled The Chimney Boy Files reignited national fascination. Clips showed aerial drone footage of the old clearing overlaid with Joshua's photos and a voice whispering, "He didn't climb in." Within a week, millions of people were dissecting the mystery, slowing down the audio, claiming to hear hidden phrases beneath the wind. True crime forums lit up again. Locals woke to strangers wandering their streets with cameras, demanding to see where it happened. For Woodland Park, it was déjà vu. The story had been quiet for nearly a decade, but in 2025, silence no longer stayed buried. It could be edited, shared, looped, an algorithmic haunting that no one could turn off. The internet turned the case into an interactive puzzle. Reddit users overlaid topographic maps of the forest, plotting heat signatures and magnetic anomalies. TikTok sleuths compared the cabin's old blueprints against missing person records, searching for patterns. Someone claimed to have found a second chimney foundation buried beneath the soil. But when police inspected the coordinates, there was nothing there but frost and pine needles. Others began live streaming their own investigations, filming at night, tagging locations in real time. It stopped being journalism and became participation. For every viewer hoping for truth, there were 10 more who just wanted to feel close to the fear. And in that feedback loop, the line between storytelling and summoning blurred until no one could tell which side of the screen the mystery lived on. In March 2025, a psychology lecturer from Colorado Springs announced a study on collective anxiety and unresolved tragedy. She used the Joshua Maddox case as her primary subject, inviting volunteers to immerse themselves in every available file, photo, and article, then track how it affected their sleep. Within days, she shut the study down. Participants reported identical dreams, tight spaces, downward motion, muffled voices behind walls. The lecturer herself began experiencing sleep paralysis. "It's like the story talks back," she said in her final post before deleting her academic page. The university made no statement. The rumor online was that the data wasn't lost. It was sealed under research ethics, too disturbing to release. Some say that was an excuse. Others think it's exactly what the story wanted, to stay open, hungry, unfinished. That same spring, a local art student constructed a partial replica of the chimney from salvaged bricks, displaying it in a small gallery downtown. Visitors were encouraged to look inside. Many swore the air within was colder than the room, the sound inside dull and hollow like a deep inhale. After 3 weeks, the installation was abruptly removed. The curator claimed it was vandalized. Someone had slipped a folded piece of paper between the bricks. The note read, "He's out." No one saw who left it. The student who built the exhibit later told reporters she regretted making it. "It felt like copying a wound," she said, "and wounds don't like being replicated." Now, in 2025, the clearing remains unchanged. The grass grows unevenly. The air stays colder than the rest of the forest. Yet the noise around it has never been louder. Podcasts, YouTube channels, and TikTok reels all use the same phrases. The unsolved chimney, the trapped boy, the case that shouldn't exist. Each retelling adds another layer, another theory, another voice speaking into the same hollow. Locals have learned not to correct anyone. They just let the stories breathe. Late at night, when the wind cuts through the pines, it carries something that sounds like static, an echo of all the screens replaying the same scene over and over. The story hasn't aged, it's adapted. And somewhere between the forest and the feed, Joshua's name keeps surfacing. Proof that in 2025, a mystery doesn't die when you stop talking about it. It dies when you finally do. As interest flared again, reporters from online outlets began returning to Woodland Park. They arrived with microphones clipped to jackets, voice recorders whispering like insects, asking the same questions that had been asked for 17 years. Most residents refused to talk. A few relented, their faces blurred on camera, speaking about strange little consistencies, how dogs avoided the clearing, how phone batteries drained there faster than anywhere else, how every few years someone new arrived promising closure and left with only more confusion. The interviews never aired in full. The producers said the audio quality degraded inexplicably, voices dropping into low, distorted murmurs. They blamed wind, feedback, malfunction. But one technician later swore that when she isolated the background track, she heard another voice under the interviews, a quiet, rhythmic tapping, like fingers brushing brick. By midsummer 2025, the town had grown used to journalists, but one day, an unmarked black SUV parked near the trailhead. Two men in plain clothes walked to the clearing, spent less than 15 minutes there, and left without speaking to anyone. The next morning, the property was taped off again under the pretext of environmental assessment. Nothing official followed, and the tape vanished a week later. People whispered that new evidence had been found, a bootlace, a coin, a bone, but no report surfaced. When a local blogger asked the county clerk for documents about renewed activity, the file numbers were missing from the database. It might have been bureaucracy. It might have been something else. Either way, the forest had been disturbed again, and every disturbance seemed to wake something older, quieter, patient. Everyone in Woodland Park has a version of the story now. Some believe Joshua fell victim to a prank gone wrong. Others insist he stumbled onto something, an illegal operation hidden in the forest that needed to stay secret. There are even those who believe he never existed at all, that Joshua Maddox is an urban legend built from fragments of different missing boys. Yet when you ask them to prove it, they hesitate. They remember the family, the posters, the search parties. The facts blur because the story's gravity bends them. Proximity warps everything around it. The truth may be simple, but the noise has grown louder than any fact could survive. The longer the story stays unsolved, the more people begin to prefer it that way. Mystery, after all, lasts longer than memory. On the 1st of October 2025, the streaming documentary finally premiered. It was titled simply The Chimney. It opened with slow drone footage over the forest, the sound of wind and faint static beneath a narrator's calm voice. Viewers described the feeling as suffocating, as though the story itself were pressing down on them. Halfway through the film, the screen flickered and cut to black for a full 7 seconds. When the image returned, the narration resumed mid-sentence, but transcripts later showed that no such pause had been scripted. Some claimed they heard breathing during that silence. Others said it was just an editing glitch, but the production company never addressed it, and within a week, by 8th October 2025, the film disappeared from the platform without notice. Pirated copies still circulate online, their audio warped, the silence somehow longer each time it's played. Now the forest stands as it always has, motionless, listening. The last pieces of the chimney lie buried under roots and moss, bricks turned to soil. People still come, still whisper, still record, but the story remains unchanged. Those who walk the clearing at dusk say the air thickens there, that sound dulls as if the world itself is holding its breath. They stand for a moment, then leave quickly, unwilling to admit what they felt. From the road, the pines look ordinary. From the inside, they lean closer together as though guarding what they know. Somewhere beneath them lies the space where a boy was found and where every question still points downward. The wind sighs through the trees, passing through that emptiness, turning it into voice. And if you stay long enough, you might hear it, soft but certain. He never climbed in.